I want to welcome you to A Dozen Good Ideas About Committees on Ministry. I am Lisa Presley, your host for the evening, the District Executive of the Heartland District in the MidAmerica region. And I'm honored to have with me tonight the Reverend Barbara Child as our subject expert on Committees on Ministry. Barbara has served for many years, most recently as an interim minister in a number of congregations, and she has also served on our Commission on Social Witness and our Commission on Appraisal for the UUA. And she has lots of good ideas and thoughts about this webinar. It is being brought to you by the MidAmerica region, which is Central Midwest, Heartland, and Prairie StarDistricts. And now, Barbara, I'd like to turn to you to have a chalice lighting for us this evening.
Thank you, Lisa. Lisa, I appreciate so much the invitation to present this webinar, and I thank all the rest of you who have joined us this evening. I turn to good colleague minister from Michigan, Penny Hackett Evans, for words to accompany a chalice lighting. And Penny has written, "As others before us have sought to make ordinary times special by lighting a candle, we now seek to transform this ordinary time into a special time set apart by lighting the flaming chalice, symbol of our beloved community." And I love the chalice picture that we have on the screen. My thanks for that as well. Lisa asked me when I gave her my original ideas here to make sure that I gave a real definition of a committee on ministry. And so that's really what this first idea is about, to say that a well-conceived committee on ministry is a primary agent of the entire congregation to encourage the professional clergy, the lay leaders, really the whole congregation at large, to work together for the best possible fulfillment of the congregation's mission and its covenant. And I want to mention right now that you will discover when you get to the end of the slides that I've given you a super resource. And this is my colleague Robert Latham, who really taught me, I think, more than anybody else, about what a good functioning committee on ministry ought to be. And he has his model described in detail in a book that you will find the citation to in a slide way at the end. So I want to make sure here at the beginning that I'm giving Robert good credit, because that's what he stresses more than anything else, that the Committee on Ministry is the monitor of everything related to the mission of the congregation and the covenant that the members and the clergy and the staff have with each other. It's common for bylaws to say how the committee members are chosen, that is, whether they're appointed by the board or elected by the congregation, also how many members there are of the committee, and the length of their terms. I'm going to suggest that after this webinar, you have a quick look at your own bylaws to see whether they are appropriate or not. Because if they are appropriate, they will provide that the Committee on Ministry is made up of congregants who are well respected by both the professional ministry and the congregants, and that it's not viewed from an adversary point of view with so many members chosen by the minister and so many chosen by the congregation. That's a way of selection that used to be common, actually, because that's not going to serve the kind of committee on ministry that we think of today. Those bylaws will also, if they're good ones, provide for regular rotation and for term limits, so that the members of the Committee on Ministry don't get entrenched. A well-chosen Committee on Ministry consists of people that I would describe this way. They have been active in the congregation long enough to be familiar with its history and culture, and I would say that probably means about at least 3 years they've been in the congregation. That doesn't necessarily mean they signed the book 3 years ago, but they've been there and been active 3 years. Then they are generally respected throughout the congregation, as well as by the clergy and by the other staff members too. Next, they don't bring to the committee any personal agenda of their own. Next, they're able to focus on the big picture of the entire mission and the covenant and the ministry of the congregation, rather than on some particular slice of congregational life. I think so often, whether we're talking about boards or committees on ministry or search committees, there is a, to my way of thinking, goofy idea out there that we ought to have somebody who represents social justice and somebody who represents religious education and who knows what all else. But that's not the way that you create a good committee on ministry. They aren't to be representatives of some particular slice of congregational life. Next, they are skilled at communication and they're adept at dealing with all people, honestly and straightforwardly. And finally, they have a devoted commitment to the well-being of the congregation and its ministry. That's my description of a committee with ideal members on it. The whole congregational system operates better if there is no overlap between the board and the Committee on Ministry. And therefore, if you take care to have two totally separate groups for the board and the Committee on Ministry, then you will have more people engaged in significant roles in the congregation, which is a good thing. Also, that means that a good Committee on Ministry is a good leadership training ground, so that people who rotate off the Committee on Ministry are naturals to be elected to the board. And that results, of course, in benefit to both bodies. And, of course, the opposite can work well, too. That is, when somebody completes a term on the board, that person becomes a natural for future service on the Committee on Ministry. And this is about communication. A good Committee on Ministry communicates constantly, and I would say by every means it can think of, regarding the state of the mission and the state of the covenant as lived out through the congregation's ministry. So the way I put it is to say it keeps people from going to sleep. It keeps them from being complacent. It keeps them from forgetting what it means that they are a congregation and not a club and not a lecture society and not a political action committee. So communicate. They are very busy in communication all the time. A good committee on ministry is. The next slide is about what I think of as a study group on the history of the denominational shift from ministerial relations committees, which in the old days were support groups for individual ministers, to congregations committees on ministry. And a study group is a really good way to do a checkup in your congregation on whether that shift has actually happened in the congregation's practice or whether it's happened only in name. I came to this business of a study group as I was doing one interim ministry after another, and I was finding that it was pretty common that the congregation did have something that it called a committee on ministry. But when I would begin to notice what this committee on ministry really was, it wasn't a committee on ministry such as I've described here. It was really the old Ministerial Relations Committee that had simply been given a new name. And I think there's a way for you to begin to notice whether this shift has actually happened or not. If congregants refer regularly to the Minister's Committee on Ministry, or if the minister regularly refers to my Committee on Ministry, then it's not really a Committee on Ministry. It's really an old-style Ministerial Relations Committee simply operating with a new name. There's another clue that this transition has not happened, and that is that if in your congregation the DRE has a committee, I don't know what it would be called, I guess it would be called a DRE Relations Committee or some such thing, or even if the administrator has a committee or the music director has a committee, then it's pretty clear what those are, and they're not committees on ministry. They're support groups. They may be, in my worst moments, what I call the palace guard, making sure that no ill thoughts cross the minister's study door. Or they may be the opposite. They may be the complaint bureau, inviting everybody who has complained about anything to come to the Committee on Ministry. These are not healthy. These are invitations to triangling, and is a really good thing that probably about 20 years ago now, this shift began to happen. But when I hear people talk about my Committee on Ministry or the Minister's Committee on Ministry, I know very well that shift is not finished. There's another cue about all this, and that is that in the old settlement handbook, the advice stuff that would be given to ministers in search and that would also be given to ministerial search committees, was that very naturally the search committee, the ministerial search committee, would become the Committee on Ministry for the first, I don't know what, six months, maybe a year, of the new minister's time. Well, we got that changed finally. I hope it's changed in everybody's thinking, as it is in I think any new papers that come out from the UUA about this. because, again, that notion that those people who know the minister well now because of being together through the search process would be the best people to be the Committee on Ministry. What does it say? It says this new minister needs a support group. This new minister needs some group of folks to hold his hand or hold her hand while they get started. And my response to that is nonsense. If the minister needs to have a support group, and sure enough, ministers do need support groups, anybody does, the place to go is one's peers, not one's congregants, any of one's congregants for support. If it's truly a committee on ministry, it will have existed and be carrying out its life before the new minister ever appeared. And its rotation will be happening, and its term limits will be happening, and everybody will understand it as a committee of the congregation, not of the minister. So, as you can tell, I have a bit of a soapbox on this one. I think it was one of our least healthy system things, and I'm very glad that it's at least in the process of changing, if not totally changed.
And Barbara, could I just add, for some people, I know my experience at the beginning of my ministry was that the committee or the Ministerial Relations Committee was where people who had difficulty talking with the minister about important issues would be directed to have that group, when Barbara refers to the triangulation, that group would then carry the concern to the minister rather than helping the person speak directly to the minister themselves. And anytime we get into congregational systems where people are not able to talk one-to-one about what's going on in the congregation, that then tells me that there is a much larger issue at stake in that whole adventure. So just wanted to give that example.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Idea number 6. And this is about evaluations, because it is important that the professional clergy go through evaluation with some regularity, but not in a vacuum. In other words, if we have an understanding that the ministry of the church is carried out by a whole lot of people, the professional clergy included, but not exclusively, then the whole ministry needs to go through regular evaluation. And the Committee on Ministry, if it is a well-conceived one and a sensibly populated one, is an appropriate body to conduct evaluations regularly, probably by dividing up all the aspects of the ministry of the congregation into manageable chunks, so that one chunk gets evaluated 1 year and another chunk the next year. And so the evaluation of the professional clergy just comes along in its place in the rotation of evaluation. So the Committee on Ministry is then monitoring everybody's accountability, not just the minister, the professional clergy's accountability.
And Barbara, I believe you're going to be speaking later about the different roles of the board and also any personnel committees in this evaluation, or is that a good time to ask that question now?
Well, I can bring that up now. Sure, thank you. And what I would be saying about the personnel committee is that it's not an appropriate body to be evaluating anybody ever. A personnel committee is a wonderful body to work up policies with regard to personnel, work up job application forms perhaps, work up schemes for goal setting. But supervisors are the people to be evaluating the staff, not the personnel committee. I think I will save the board for a few minutes from now because I do want to make a distinction there between the board's role and the Committee on Ministry's role.
And there's also a question someone has just written in, which is on the idea of the Committee on Ministry and the congregational system. They're wondering what kind of training might there be available for that. Now, I can tell you that if you're looking for leadership training in general, you can refer to many webinars that are on the Midwest UU Leadership website. But there's also within the UUA website, the Tapestry of Faith curriculum has a particular curriculum called Harvest the Power. That is a leadership development curriculum. So that's one place to get leadership development. I didn't know if you had other things you wish to say about this to help our people understand what kind of training you would suggest.
Well, actually this brings to my mind another book that I would like to suggest very much. And that is the book called Ministry and Governance. I think it's the other way around, Governance and Ministry, by Dan Hotchkiss. And this is an extremely helpful conceptualization. I've used Dan's book in board retreats, for instance, to have board members understand the distinction between what is appropriately board work, which is essentially policy-making work, decision-making work about the way the congregation operates, and the committees that are appropriately constituted to help the board do that work, such as a finance committee. That's on the one hand. And then the ministry is on the other hand. And it includes, of course, the pastoral work of the congregation, which the professional clergy do some of, but which typically is at least partly done by a caring committee or however it's named. Everything to do with worship, the Sunday services committee, worship associates, again, different congregations have different terminology. But all of that is ministry, some of it done by congregants, some of it done by professional clergy. And I think if people who are on a committee on ministry or who are wanting to study and understand better a committee on ministry would read Dan Hotchkiss's book, I think you could get a very good grasp there of this distinction between board and board work and ministry, the work of a whole lot of people, so that what the Committee on Ministry is monitoring and evaluating chunk by chunk, year by year, is the ministry. So Lisa's given you ideas about things that are done through the district as training. I put my faith in reading a good book. And therefore, I give you Robert Latham, the book that you will be finding noted in that slide at the end. So Robert's book, but not the whole book necessarily, just his section on the Committee on Ministry, which is an addendum at the end of the book. So Robert's book and Dan Hotchkiss's book, Governance and Ministry. I think if a committee on ministry were to commit among themselves to read both Dan Hotchkiss's book and Robert Latham's addendum on Committee on Ministry, and then have a study group based on those two texts, I think you would be very well trained to do this work. Given that the appropriate standard by which to evaluate is the congregation's mission and living in accord with its covenant, it seems that a good committee on ministry can keep everybody's focus on the mission and on the covenant. And, of course, that means, first of all, making sure that the congregation actually has a mission and has a covenant. And by that, I don't mean a musty old mission statement that some group wordsmithed 10 years ago, but as I think the language we used a year or two back was a burning coal at the heart, an actual mission and a covenant, an actual sense of agreement among the folks as to how we're going to treat one another. Then what the job of the Committee on Ministry is, at least in part, is to make sure, first, that they exist, mission and covenant, and second, that people know what they are. Number 8 seems to be what I have already just talked about, doesn't it? The distinction between the work of the board as policymakers and the work of the Committee on Ministry as monitors. So the board has the authority to make decisions that result in things happening or not happening. And the Committee on Ministry actually doesn't have the power to make anything happen except by the power of persuasion. It isn't there to invite people to do certain things so much as it is to invite people to have the mission and the covenant in perspective all the time about everything that's done. I think it's helpful for a Committee on Ministry to see itself as a consulting body. It consults regularly with the professional clergy and with the other staff as well, I should think. Also with the board, with any task forces or teams or committees, anything, no matter how it's named, that takes part in the congregation's ministry. And then it's in a position to make recommendations as well as to share its impressions about how things are going, with the understanding, and I think it's important that a Committee on Ministry keep clear in its own thinking that it is not a decision-making body. It's not going to make decisions about actions to be taken. It makes its recommendations, and then it gets out of the way for the decision makers to do their thing. I think a good Committee on Ministry serves well by engaging in ongoing conflict management. And when we brought up the triangling before, I think that was a good example of the kind of thing I mean here. A lot of people have heard the word triangling, but probably don't really know in a lot of detail what that means. They may have heard that we engage in systems thinking, but they may not know very much about what that means. And knowing those things has to do a lot with a congregation being wise about managing conflicts. And so one of the things that a Committee on Ministry can do is to sponsor workshops bring in speakers, for instance. See that adult religious education happens. Occasionally, it may mean having a town meeting for something to be taken up. But the Committee on Ministry is not itself the arbiter of any conflict, and it's also certainly not the judge of who's right or who's wrong in any conflict. But as Lisa mentioned when we were talking about triangling, it certainly can work to encourage people to go directly to whatever person they're having a conflict with. And I suppose the bottom line on this is that the Committee on Ministry does not take sides whenever there's any conflict. A well-functioning Committee on Ministry, working well with the professional clergy, can model and can also teach others about the value of shared ministry, that is, professional clergy and laity working together to carry out the ministry of the church. They can be engaged in education about ministry in general and ministry of this particular congregation also. And this education can serve well the regular determination of short-term and also long-term goals for the congregation. A well-functioning Committee on Ministry, working with both the clergy and the board, can model and teach also mutual trust and accountability. And thus, it seems to me, they are constantly fostering right relationship in the congregation in accord with its covenant. When Lisa asked me would consider doing this webinar, she said, well, you could start out by saying, what are 10 good ideas about the subject? And when I sat down to write 10 good ideas, I realized I couldn't stop there. So that's why we have a dozen instead. I see I have a question from Kathy Harrington, right? Should the Committee on Ministry never pass a complaint or concern without revealing the source? And the answer is you bet. To do that would certainly be participating in a triangle. This is one of the ways, I think, that we encourage people to learn how to be direct, even though it's hard. For instance, if there's any kind of evaluation form, people need to sign it. If people have a complaint, they need to acknowledge that it's theirs. The secret complaint system is one that really encourages rumor mills. It encourages having something that's really a very tiny molehill begin to appear to be a mountain. So I actually think this is an easy open and shut. The answer is no. Never pass.
And one caveat to that before you move on to your caveat, the only reason that I say a committee should pass that on would be if it's an issue that the committee members themselves can own and bring in their own names. Because then it gets back to direct communication. So if someone triggers something by talking to you that you also say, then a committee member could, in their own voice, say, this is something that's bothered me and I want to talk with you about it. But that's a very different thing because it's not a triangle anymore. It's the member of the committee owning up to their own concern about this. They may not say dozens of people agree with me. But now, would you agree with that statement, Barbara?
Oh, yeah, sure, because I would say that's a different question. Then you are revealing the source, and the source is yourselves.
Right. And Claudia posted a question here that she put, I thought part of, or somebody in her group at least, I thought that part of conflict resolution is confidentiality of the people involved. And I would say no. The job of conflict resolution is to help people own up to what's going on and to be able to work together to resolve. Because if you can't be in conversation with somebody about the issue, then there's no way that you can really understand it. And that part of what our religious communities call us to is to learn better ways of dealing with each other around difficult and hard issues. And if we can't practice that within our covenantal community, where we say we uphold the dignity and worth of every person, then we have absolutely no chance of ever resolving those kinds of issues out in the wider world. And so our congregations are a way to practice that. What you try to do in any conflict resolution is to make sure that people are not scapegoated, that there are protections for people's well-being, but that kind of secrecy or confidentiality does not work within our covenantal communities. At least that's my opinion. What about you, Barbara?
Well, I want to take this question back to what is and is not the role of the Committee on Ministry. Conflict resolution is not the role of the Committee on Ministry. I make the distinction between conflict resolution and conflict management. And that's why I talk about conflict management as actually an educational function in which the Committee on Ministry engages in educating the entire congregation. Conflict resolution is a role of an arbiter or a judge, and that is not Committee on Ministry work.
Well, I really do believe that if we are trying to resolve something, unless everybody can be a party to it, then you can't resolve it, because you're then you're trying to resolve something with ghosts, and all you can do is, in those situations, is ask someone to just go along with somebody else's idea, but there's no way that they can resolve it if they can't be face-to-face or at least know each other's identity and be in communication with each other. But that is another workshop and webinar.
Right. Okay. Yes. My caveat comes of knowing realistically that more and more people, and I guess by people I should be saying ministers really, are busy having committees on ministry not happen anymore. They are becoming less and less popular, I think, among ministers. This is a tricky phenomenon, I think. I've tried to think about how is this happening, why is it happening, what do I have to say about it? My sense of it is that the unpopularity, the growing unpopularity of committees on ministry is a result of that shift that I talked about from Ministerial Relations Committee to Committee on Ministry not having happened. I think we have been kidding ourselves a lot by changing the name, thinking that changing the name meant we changed the body, changed the entity. So what it is that people don't like are the old committees on ministerial relations. If there were a committee on ministry, such as I've described tonight, such as Robert Latham describes in the addendum in his book, I don't think people would be so hot to be rid of them, because I think they are a really wonderful tool for teaching and practicing shared ministry and covenant within a congregation. So that's one thing I have to say about it. But I also acknowledge that the people who are most energetic, I guess, about getting rid of committees on ministry tend to be the larger churches. And I think the larger the congregation, the less likely there is real need for a committee on ministry, because the whole structure of the congregation and its governance is managed in a different way with an executive team, for instance. But I would say the smaller the congregation, the more likely that a properly understood committee on ministry can be a very, very fine, health-producing part of congregational life. End of caveat.
Here is where we show the title of the book by Robert Latham, Moving On from Church Folly Lane. And it is at Addendum 6. Barbara even puts the page numbers there. And it can be ordered directly from Robert through the first of those links, mythinglink.com, or through the UUA bookstore also stocks this book. Are there questions out there?
This might sound silly, but we just created a suggestion box, and your comments on signing evaluations made me wonder. It seems that some people think that there should be a policy and control of the suggestions left in the box. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I surely would treat that in the same way. And one way to explain it to people is, first of all, I'd want to know, to whom are the suggestions going? Is this suggestions to the board? Is this suggestions to the minister, to the committee on ministry? You know, it might differ, might make a difference depending on what the publicity about this suggestion box is. But in general, I would be inclined to say we need to know who you are when you make a suggestion, because we might very well want to come back to you to get clarification, to find out some more about what you're thinking, whatever.
Right, and I guess in my mind, anything that starts getting secret is not healthy.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
I'm with you.
And this is Lisa, and I'm also very well with you both.
Okay.
Because if we can't, as I said earlier, if we can't have the tough conversations with each other in our congregations, then our congregations are not doing their job of equipping people to live in this real world.
Exactly.
And to pretend that we don't have to be accountable with and to each other, but that a suggestion could be done. Now, the one thing I could see being anonymous is someone writing in something that says, you all are doing a terrific job, and I'm so glad I found you. That kind of stuff I would agree could be anonymous. But anything that, and because, there's the wonderful story about, that I won't go into, but it's about, the Messiah might be one of you.
Right.
That question that then transforms an entire community because they look at each other with those eyes. That kind of positive thing could be anonymous, but nothing that suggests anything beyond celebration totally.
Great. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Are there other questions?
Yeah, this is Shelley Page.
Hi, Shelley.
Barbara, I'm going to want to talk to you offline about a few things.
Okay.
Nothing bad, just opportunities I see here at Grosse Pointe, and wondering what to do first on some things. Just as a point of clarification, I went through the search process last year, and the model agreements still, they called this entity Committee on Ministry, but they suggested still, as of last year, populating that committee in the first few months or first year with some members from the search committee.
Yeah.
And which is exactly what we've been doing. Yeah. And I'm listening to your presentation going, oh, goodness. So not sure where to go next with that, but just wanted to share with you that shift, unless it's happened in the last year with what the UUA is sending out to congregations and to prospective ministers, as of last year it wasn't done.
I know. It's the shift is coming in the materials that go through the ministerial settlement reps.
Right, but the issue there is that the joint agreements on letters of agreement by the UUA and the UUMA is available online for anyone to access. And so perhaps, Barbara, that's something you can bring up with the head of transitions to help us all out.
Oh, indeedy. That's one I had not thought of, that would be still there. And I know that people,
really helpful to me.
Yeah, people really feel some pressure, I suppose, to follow what those agreements look like. Well, I don't know. I've been beating this drum, and I will beat it more loudly now.
Claudia in Bowling Green with just a quick concern and kind of elaboration on something we've touched tonight. I was concerned throughout this year that our committee did seem to become an advocate or a sounding board for our minister. And I was one of the only few who felt that way, and I felt like, am I the only one who's worried about this? I'd like to have a little more elaboration about how do you know where you've crossed the line and you've stopped being concerned with overall congregational ministry and you're just listening to your minister who's having difficult conflicts and just wants to share?
Well, I think it may be a little bit difficult to shift midstream. If the congregation has, over some period of time in the past, had what were called ministerial relations committees, and especially if your bylaws reflect that thought, that's very difficult, like turning the ship around in the ocean, I guess, to get that shift to happen, and particularly to get it to happen with the same people who have been thinking the other way. I don't know what history your minister has with this. So I think if this conversation tonight on this webinar has raised some questions for you, maybe that would be a very profitable conversation for the present existing Committee on Ministry, of which you are a part, and the minister to sit down together and talk over.
Somebody else has a quick question.
We're a small and growing congregation. We don't have a COM or a pastoral relations committee, so which is kind of nice. We can start out right.
Right. Good for you.
But I'm perceiving is that the COM sort of does an overview of all the ministries, but I'm not sure. Would that include like Sunday morning worship services and the music, RE, all of those things, or just more programmatic things or folk? Do you know what I'm asking?
It does include all of those things.
Okay.
And as I listen to you, that underscores for me how valuable I think it would be for you to read Dan Hotchkiss's book on governance and ministry, because the distinction between governance, board work, committees that help the board do its work on the one hand, and ministry on the other hand, is an incredibly useful conceptual understanding to have.
Yeah,
I think having that understanding can help the members of a committee on ministry ever so much to really get what their job is and where it ends, what the boundaries are on the role of the Committee on Ministry.
Right, great. And so also for the board, because our board is taking on staff evaluations, which doesn't seem...
dear heaven.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's why I'm here tonight, so thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you for being here.
And in wrapping up, I really want to thank you, Barbara, for sharing all of your information with us this evening. I want to let people know through this slide that this webinar will be up. You can look at all our webinars on this MidwestUUleadership.org site. Well, Barbara, thank you so much. I so value your information and your willingness to share it with all our good people here in MidAmerica.
Well, it certainly was fun for me, and I'm grateful to you and to everybody who participated.
So thank you very much, everyone, and good night.